She stepped off the stagecoach into a warrant, a Pinkerton agent, and a sheriff who had already made up his mind. She had nowhere to run. Then a stranger she had never met walked out of the crowd, stood between her and the law, and said four words that changed everything. This is the story of the lie he told to save her and the truth that turned it into something neither of them expected. The stagecoach rolled into Silver Creek at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in December of 1876, and the world outside the fogged window was the color of old iron. Adelaide Hayes pressed her face close enough to the glass to feel its cold against her cheekbone. She had not slept properly in 2 days. The seat beneath her was hard leather gone stiff with winter, and the road through the Wyoming Territory was nothing like the cobblestone avenues of Philadelphia she had left behind 11 weeks ago. But she did not care about the road or the cold or the ache in her lower back from the long hours of travel. She cared only about the bag. It sat on her lap as it had sat on her lap through 6 different train carriages and 3 stagecoaches, through the flat plains of Illinois and the long brown roll of Kansas, and the purple rise of the mountains, as the West declared itself to her in the only language it knew, which was sighs. The bag was brown leather cracked at one corner, with 2 brass buckles she kept fastened even when the stagecoach lurched and the other passengers muttered and grabbed for handholds. Her fingers never left the strap. Inside that bag were 4 small ledger books bound in oilskin and a letter written in a hand she would have recognized in complete darkness, her father's hand. Edmund Hayes had been the chief accountant of the Sterling Pacific Railroad for 12 years. He had been a patient man, methodical to the point of tenderness, the sort of man who balanced the household accounts for pleasure and taught his daughter that numbers told the truth when people could not be trusted to do the same. He had worked at his desk by lamplight long after Adelaide had gone to bed as a child, surrounded by columns of figures that meant nothing to the untrained eye, and everything to a man who had spent his career learning to read them like a language. 3 years ago, he had found something in those numbers, something he was not supposed to find. He had not told Adelaide immediately. He had written it all down first carefully, precisely the way he did everything, filling 4 small ledger books with names and dates and transactions and the kind of accumulated detail that could only be assembled by a man who understood that truth, in order to survive, must be documented with the same care one gives to the thing it is meant to survive against. He had hidden the ledgers behind a loose brick beneath the kitchen windowsill. Then on the 13th of October, 1876, Edmund Hayes had fallen from a 3rd-floor window of the Sterling Pacific offices in Philadelphia. The official verdict was accident. The investigation lasted 4 days and concluded that no foul play was involved. The man who signed that conclusion was named on the 3rd page of Edmund's ledgers beside a notation of the sum he had received and the date on which he had received it. Adelaide had found the ledgers 2 days after the funeral, following the instructions in the last letter her father had ever written to her. She had read every word of the first ledger in a single sitting at the kitchen table while the house was being watched by men she did not recognize from the street below. She had left Philadelphia that same night. 11 weeks, 8 states, 3 stagecoaches, and now Silver Creek. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and looked at the town materializing through the gray afternoon light, and thought for the first time in 11 weeks that she might be able to breathe. She did not know yet how wrong she was. The town was small enough that a stranger stepping off a stagecoach could be read like a headline. The main street was unpaved, the buildings modest, the wooden storefronts carrying the worn-out look of structures put up fast and kept standing by necessity alone. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a land office with a window that needed replacing, a saloon whose piano Adelaide could hear faintly even through the walls of the coach as it slowed and stopped, a bright and indifferent sound in the cold air. She had barely set her foot on the frozen ground before she saw him. Sheriff Holt Barrett was not a large man, but he carried himself like one. He was somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and hard choices into something that resembled less a face and more a record of decisions made. He walked toward her from the direction of the county office with the unhurried stride of a man who had done this kind of thing many times and had learned that speed did not improve the outcome. Behind him came two men Adelaide had never seen before, but recognized immediately. Not their faces, their posture, the stillness of men who had been hired to retrieve something and had located it. Professional stillness. The stillness of people for whom other people are primarily obstacles or assets. Never anything more complicated than that. Their eyes went to the bag, not to her face, not to her travel-worn dress, or her honey hair loosening from its pins after days of motion, or the exhaustion she could not quite hide behind the straight line of her spine. To the bag on her arm with its two brass buckles and its cracked corner and everything inside it that was worth more to certain people than her continued existence. Sheriff Barrett stopped 2 feet in front of her and removed a folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat. He held it with the look of a man holding something he would prefer not to be holding. Miss Adelaide Margaret Hayes. His voice was flat and even, the voice of someone reading from a document rather than speaking their own words, and Adelaide understood immediately that this was not incidental. It was a choice. He was a man who wanted the distance of the official record between himself and what he was about to say. She said nothing. She looked at him directly, which seemed to register with him in some small way. He continued, I am Holt Barrett, Sheriff of Silver Creek County. I hold a warrant for your arrest issued at the request of the Sterling Pacific Railroad Corporation and confirmed by the Office of the Governor of Wyoming Territory with a supporting declaration from the United States Department of Justice. A pause, not theatrical, simply careful. You are charged with theft of proprietary corporate documents valued at $50,000 and with obstruction of a federal investigation into the death of one Edmund Hayes employee of Sterling Pacific Railroad on the 13th of October, 1876. The square around them had gone quiet, not empty, quiet. The people who had been moving through their Tuesday afternoon had slowed and stopped turning with the unself-conscious curiosity that small towns never apologize for. Adelaide stood very still. Her hand beneath the strap of the bag did not tremble. She had been practicing this since October, not this moment specifically, but the general act of receiving terrible things without visibly breaking under their weight. Her father had taught her this too, though he had never named it for what it was. He had simply modeled it year after year, the quiet endurance of a man who believed that composure was a form of integrity and not merely a performance. The man in the expensive coat stepped forward. He was perhaps 40 years old with gray eyes that assessed rather than simply looked, in a suit that had been cut in a city that was not Wyoming. Everything about him was deliberate, from the precise angle of his hat to the way he positioned himself at Barrett's shoulder rather than behind it close enough to observe Adelaide's hands without appearing to make a point of doing so. My name is Silas Greer, he said. I represent the Pinkerton National Detective Agency engaged by Sterling Pacific Railroad in this matter. His voice carried the smoothness of a man accustomed to rooms where the prices were not listed because the clientele was not expected to ask. I believe you are currently in possession of certain company documents removed without authorization from the Sterling Pacific offices in Philadelphia. If you would surrender the bag and accompany us quietly, this can be resolved without further inconvenience to yourself or to anyone else. He looked at the bag when he said it, not at her, at the bag. Before we continue, I want to take just a moment to say if this is your first time finding one of these stories, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. I put out new frontier stories every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next in this one. And if you are comfortable doing so, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight. I love hearing from you. Now, back to Silver Creek. Back to a woman standing in the cold with a warrant and a threat, and two men watching her bag, and to three brothers on the other side of the square who were about to change everything. They had come into town that morning for supplies. The Harlow Ranch sat 4 miles north of Silver Creek, 3,000 acres of Wyoming grassland that the family had shaped out of raw territory over 2 decades, first the father, and then after the father was gone, the 3 sons he had left behind. Garrett Harlow, the eldest, had been running the ranch for 5 years. He was 32 years old and looked it in the best possible sense, the way a structure looks its age when it has been built right and maintained honestly. 6 feet and 6 inches of him with dark hair worn a little long beneath a wide-brimmed hat and eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight amber and warm and containing more than most people expected when they first encountered them. He was not a man who spoke often, but when he did, the words had weight because he did not use them carelessly. Beside him stood Cole, 28 years old with auburn hair and green-gray eyes and the crossed arms and measured expression of a man who had done his arithmetic and was not pleased with the answer. Cole managed the ranch finances. He knew exactly how much they owed, exactly how thin their margins ran, and exactly how many additional complications they could absorb without serious damage to the operation, which was none. And on Garrett's other side stood Eli, 24, with brown hair and hazel eyes, in the face of a person who has been hoping something interesting would happen in Silver Creek since approximately the previous winter, and now appears to have gotten his wish. He was trying to see over Garrett's shoulder. He was not succeeding. The three of them had been standing beside their wagon on the far side of the square since the stagecoach arrived. Garrett had seen Adelaide step down from the coach. He had noted what he had expected to note based on her letters, the honey-colored hair pinned back against the cold, the modest navy traveling dress with its small lace detail at the collar, the posture that said she'd been raised to stand up straight and had not surrendered that habit, despite whatever the last several weeks had required of her. He had been about to cross the square. Then he had seen the two men behind Barrett, not Barrett himself. Barrett was a man doing a job he had inherited rather than chosen, and that was a different kind of thing. The two men behind Barrett were doing about they had selected the kind of work that required a willingness to look at a young woman who had committed no crime and see only the object she was carrying. Garrett had seen men look at things that way before. 5 years ago, a man named Caldwell had looked at the Harlow land that way. He had used a county sheriff in a forged receipt and 3 head of branded cattle to accomplish what he wanted, and by the time Garrett had fully understood what was happening, his father was in a jail cell convicted of theft. He had not committed dying of a fever. The county would not pay a doctor to treat. Silas Harlow had died in that cell 3 months after his arrest. Garrett had been 27 years old. He had stood in the rain outside the county building the day they told him and had not said anything, not because he had nothing to say, but because the weight of it was too large for words, and he had understood even then that it would remain so. He had never forgotten the way those men had looked at what they intended to take. He was looking at it again now. Cole's hand found his arm the moment Garrett moved. Garrett, low and level, this is not our problem. Let go, Cole. Listen to me. She is a stranger. She came off a stagecoach, and there is a federal warrant. And if you walk over there and put yourself between her and Barrett, you are going to be standing between your name and a federal warrant, and there is no version of that which ends without consequence. Cole. Garrett did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Let go. A pause, the hand released. Cole turned to look at Eli. Eli was watching Garrett cross the square with the expression of a person witnessing something they have always suspected was possible, but have never quite seen demonstrated. Garrett moved at his own pace, not slow and not hurried, with the economy of a man who had spent decades doing hard physical work in open country where unnecessary motion was a form of waste. People shifted out of his path without being explicitly asked. He stopped when he reached the arrangement of bodies around Adelaide Hayes, close enough to be part of it, far enough not to crowd it. Barrett looked at him. Harlow. Greer assessed him with the expression of a man calculating the weight of an unexpected variable. Adelaide looked at him, and in the half-second before she composed her expression into something neutral, Garrett saw something he had not anticipated. Not fear he had expected. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a person who has been reading a map and has suddenly identified a landmark. She is my bride, Garrett said. The words fell into the square the way a stone falls into standing water, with a concentric effect that spread outward through the gathered crowd in rings of silence. Barrett's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. "I beg your pardon. Adelaide Hayes." Garrett kept his voice factual and even. "We have been corresponding since June. She came here to marry me. If your warrant describes a woman of that name, Sheriff, then it is describing my prospective wife. And before anyone touches the lady or anything in her possession, I would want to see the jurisdictional authority for a private detective agency to seize personal property on Wyoming territorial soil." He was not a lawyer. He had never pretended to be one. But after his father's death, he had spent 5 years reading every legal text he could locate because he had understood that ignorance of the law had been part of what the people who destroyed his father had counted on, and he had not intended to remain ignorant. Barrett stared at him. Greer stared at him. The two men behind Greer shifted their weight in the way of people recalculating their options. And Adelaide Hayes had exactly 3 seconds. She had 47 letters from this man in her memory, not in the bag. She had read them enough times that she could reconstruct them without looking. They were not long letters. They were not letters designed to impress. They were the communications of a man who had something specific to offer and said so plainly and then stopped, because he was not the kind of person who filled space with words for their own sake. She had written back 47 times about Philadelphia and her father and the way sunlight moved through the windows of the house where she grew up. She had not told him everything, but she had told him enough to know that when he said something, he meant it. He was standing between her and the warrant. He had done this without knowing anything beyond 90 seconds of observation in a public square. Her father had said that you learned who a person truly was by watching what they did when they had no time to calculate, when the situation moved faster than deliberation, and the person was left with only what they actually were, not what they intended to be, what they were to. Adelaide placed her hand on Garrett Harlow's arm. The touch was light and practiced the gesture of a woman greeting someone she has known for a long time. She turned to Barrett with the expression she had developed over years of Philadelphia drawing rooms, composed and warm, and revealing nothing that was not meant to be revealed. "Forgive me," she said. "The journey from the last relay station was longer than I expected. I do hope I have not caused any confusion by arriving on a different coach than I had originally arranged." She felt Garrett's arm remain completely still beneath her hand. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Barrett. But she felt the single breath he drew slow and controlled, and she understood that he had heard what she said and had accepted what it meant, the weight she had just placed beside his own. Barrett was not a man who was easily moved by what he wanted to see. He had been a sheriff for 23 years. He had a warrant in his pocket and a telegram from the governor's office and 2 weeks of pressure from people whose names he did not normally hear in ordinary conversation. He had the face of a man who had stood in rooms where powerful people told him what to do and had found in many occasions that the powerful people were correct and had found on certain other occasions that they were not. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Adelaide. He looked at the way her hand rested on the rancher's arm, and he looked at the way Garrett did not touch her in return, but did not step away, and he thought, "You have been corresponding," he said. "'Cause June," Garrett said, "and she was coming here specifically to marry you." She was. Barrett looked at Greer. Greer's face had not altered in any way that an inattentive observer would register. But something behind his gray eyes had moved the brief recalibration of a professional encountering an obstacle he had not accounted for, weighing his options with the speed and precision his employer's money had purchased. "Sheriff Barrett," he said, "this is a federal matter. Whatever personal arrangements Mr. Harlow may claim to have with this woman, I said I would look into it." Barrett had surprised himself slightly with those words. He put the warrant back in his coat pocket. "I am not going to remove a man's intended wife from a stagecoach in a public square on the basis of a corporate warrant that may or may not apply to the individual in question. I will verify the documentation through the marshal's office in Cheyenne." He turned to Adelaide. "Miss Hayes, I am asking you to remain in the county While this is clarified, do you understand? Completely, she said. Harlow. The word carried a warning that did not need to be made explicit. You are putting your name to a significant claim. I know what my name is worth, Garrett said. 3 full seconds of held attention. Then Barrett nodded once, turned, and walked away. The crowd dispersed with the murmuring energy of people who have witnessed something worth discussing and intend to discuss it at length. Greer watched Barrett go. He had no immediate choice, not here, not in front of a county sheriff who had just introduced a complication into what had been intended to be a clean retrieval. But as the square cleared, Greer stepped forward. He positioned himself close enough to Adelaide to speak beneath the ambient noise of dispersal. His voice was almost pleasant. Miss Hayes, we know what you are carrying. We have always known. The warrant exists because it is cleaner than the alternatives available to us. But you are an intelligent woman and you understand that alternatives do exist. He glanced briefly toward the 3 Harlow brothers, Garrett still holding Barrett's gaze a few yards away. Cole watching from the wagon with his arms recrossed, Eli standing very still for the first time all afternoon. These gentlemen have placed themselves in a complicated position by involving themselves in your situation. I would encourage you to think carefully about whether that serves their interests. He adjusted his coat lapel with a slight movement and walked away at a measured pace, and Adelaide watched him go with the calm of a person who is feeling something very serious and has decided that feeling it openly would not be useful. For 2 months, she had been afraid for herself. That had been manageable because she was practiced at bearing her own weight. This was a different kind of fear. It had other people's names on it. The wagon was a working vehicle, weighed in plain, and smelling of hay and honest labor, with boards worn smooth in the middle and rough at the edges. Adelaide sat up front beside Garrett, who held the reins. Cole and Eli rode in the back. The horses moved north out of town with the reliable patience of animals that know the way home. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. She watched Silver Creek diminish behind them and the land open up, that sheer lateral drama of the Wyoming Territory that Philadelphia had done nothing to prepare her for. The sky was the pale gray of old tin. The ground was dusted with the season's first snow, thin enough to see the brown grass beneath, thick enough to make everything look provisional, like the rough draft of something waiting to be committed to. Eli broke first from the back of the wagon with the tone of a man who has been restraining a sentence for longer than he is comfortable with. Well, that was certainly something. Eli, Cole's voice, flat and final, 2 syllables that served as a complete argument. I am only saying that from an objective standpoint. I know what you are saying. Please do not say it. A pause of reasonable length, then silence. Garrett had not turned his head since they left the square. He watched the road with the focused calm of a man who made a practice of attending to what was directly in front of him and trusting that what was behind him would hold. After a while, he said quietly in a register that would not carry to the back of the wagon, "You do not need to explain anything tonight." "You do not know what you have done," Adelaide said. She kept her own voice equally low. "I know what I saw." He let a moment pass. "I have seen men look at something they intend to take, the way those men were looking at your bag. That is a particular quality of attention. I recognize it. You cannot know anything about me from 47 letters and 90 seconds in a town square. I know that you took my arm and played the scene without hesitation and without overplaying it." He glanced at her once briefly and without performance. Most people cannot do that. It takes a certain kind of mind. She looked at him. He had already turned his eyes back to the road. "My father had that kind of mind," she said. "He gave it to me." "Tell me about him." It was not a command and it was not prying. It was the kind of question asked by someone who genuinely wants to know the answer, and Adelaide, who had become extraordinarily careful about who she allowed to know, things found herself answering before she had consciously decided to. She told him about Edmund Hayes, not the ledgers, not the investigation, not the window. She told him about the man himself, the lamplight burning at midnight, while she fell asleep to the sound of his pen moving across paper. The Sunday mornings when he transformed household accounting into a game she played with him, following the trail of numbers from question to answer, as though each column were a path through a landscape worth exploring. The way he talked about figures, not as abstractions, but as characters, each one with a place in the story being told, each one either honest or dishonest, and the ones that were dishonest always revealing themselves eventually if you were patient enough to wait. He said numbers do not lie, she said. Only the people who interpret them do. The wagon moved through the cold in the quiet of late afternoon in open country, and Adelaide realized she had been talking for some time without watching her words and that she did not feel the need to watch them. That was a new sensation. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the light began to go. A large barn, a long, low main house built close to the ground the way structures built to withstand weather are built without vanity with purpose. A stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke was rising, because whoever had laid that fire that morning had done it correctly and it had held all day. Something in Adelaide's chest released a fraction at the sight of that smoke. She had not fully registered how cold she was until she saw evidence that warmth was possible. Garrett guided the horses through the gate and set the brake. He came around to her side of the wagon and offered his hand to help her down, not because she required it, but because it was the kind of thing he did. She understood from the completeness of the gesture that it was not meant to be observed. It was simply how he moved through the world. She climbed down with the bag still on her arm. Cole and Eli came around from the back. Cole's expression had been rearranging itself since they left Silver Creek into something that was not quite the sealed wariness of the public square, but was not open either. A man working through an arithmetic problem he had not yet resolved. Eli looked the way a person looks when they have been trying to appear as though they are not thinking about something and are not quite managing it. Inside the main room was a single large space serving as both kitchen and living quarters, dominated by a stone hearth, doing its primary work with the quiet confidence of something built well and used faithfully. A table size for more people than currently occupied it, a shelf of books, everything organized and spare in the way that spaces are organized and spare when the people who inhabit them have learned to value function over appearance, because appearance does not keep the cold out. Garrett hung his coat and hat on the hook beside the door. "There is a room at the end of the hall upstairs," he said. "It is clean. The bed is made." Adelaide looked at the room, at the fire, at the three men who had brought a stranger into their house on the basis of 47 letters and 90 seconds of observation in a town square. She crossed to the table and set the bag down. She opened the buckles. All three of them watched her. She removed one of the 4 oilskin-wrapped ledger books and placed it on the table between them. She did not open it. She placed her hands flat on either side of it and looked at Garrett first, then Cole, then Eli, because she was a woman who had been raised to address people as individuals and not as a general audience. "I am going to tell you the truth," she said. "Not all of it, not tonight, but enough." "Sit down," Garrett said without inflection, and pulled out a chair and sat in it himself. Cole remained standing. Eli sat on the edge of the hearth. Adelaide sat. "My father, Edmund Hayes, was the chief accountant of Sterling Pacific Railroad for 12 years. Franklin Sterling built his railroad at a scale that required a very large and very careful accounting operation. My father ran that operation. He was excellent at it. Sterling trusted him, which was the specific thing that made my father dangerous when he began to find what he found." She looked at the ledger on the table. "3 years ago, my father found something he was not supposed to find, not through any dramatic act. He did not break into a safe or intercept a communication. He simply paid attention to the numbers over a long enough period that patterns became visible. Discrepancies individually small and collectively enormous. Land grants recorded at one value and transferred at another. Payroll entries for workers who did not exist. Payments to individuals who, when my father identified them, turned out to be elected officials, federal officials, men in positions that allowed them to issue approvals that Sterling required and would not have received from honest parties. Eli had stopped trying to look casual. His elbows were on his knees, and he was watching her with the focused attention of someone who has realized that what he is hearing is of genuine importance. Cole's arms were still crossed, but the angle of his body had changed. Garrett had not moved. He was watching her face. He documented everything, Adelaide said. 3 years of documentation, every transaction, every name, every date, every amount. He was meticulous in the way that some people are meticulous when they have decided that what they are doing matters enough to do it correctly. He intended to bring the documentation to a federal authority he believed he could trust. He had identified one. He was making arrangements. She stopped for a moment. On the 13th of October, he fell from a window on the third floor of the Sterling Pacific offices in Philadelphia. The fire made a sound. Outside, the wind pressed against the building and found the gaps that buildings always have and made its presence known in the space between the walls. The investigation lasted 4 days, she continued. The man who oversaw it is named on the third page of that ledger with the amount he received written beside his name in my father's handwriting. The date of the payment is 3 weeks before my father died. She kept her voice level. She had been practicing this, not rehearsing it in the sense of staging it, but practicing the act of saying it out loud without letting it become something that made her unable to continue. I found the ledgers 2 days after the funeral. I left Philadelphia that night. I used Mr. Harlow's advertisement as a destination because I needed somewhere far enough and specific enough that the journey would not appear without purpose. Cole looked at Garrett. Garrett said nothing. The warrant is fabricated, Adelaide said. The charges are false. The documents are not stolen property. They are my father's work product created on his own time, using his own judgment and his own knowledge to record crimes he witnessed in the course of his legitimate employment. They are also the only reason I am alive. Sterling cannot submit to the scrutiny that would follow their being placed in front of the proper authorities. As long as I have them and he does not, he needs me to remain breathing. She looked up from the ledger. I understand what I have brought into this house. I want you to understand it as well. Those men today will come back. Greer does not give up. Sterling does not give up. What happened in the square this afternoon was generous, and I mean that without any sentiment I cannot presently afford. But it created a situation that you are now part of, and you have a right to know the full weight of it before morning. The fire was the only sound for a moment. Garrett stood and added a piece of wood to it. He did this with the practiced ease of a man who has tended fires in cold places for many years and knows exactly where to place the wood and how much attention it requires. He did not speak while he did it. When he straightened and turned back, his face held the expression Adelaide was beginning to recognize as simply his natural condition, attentive and contained, and moving toward conclusions along a path that was not visible from the outside. The warrant, he said, is there anything in it that is true? My name, she said. Everything else is Sterling's. Another silence. Eli looked at his oldest brother. Cole looked at the table, and then at Garrett, and then back at the table. Garrett sat back down. The men who framed my father knew what they were doing, he said. They were careful. They built the accusation inside a structure that people were inclined to trust, which is why it was difficult to disprove. His eyes found Adelaide's. Is Sterling careful? Sterling employs careful people, she said. He himself is careful primarily about outcomes. Garrett nodded once slowly as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. There is a room upstairs at the end of the hall, he said. Get some sleep. We will talk in the morning about what comes next. Mr. Harlow, she did not stand. I am not asking you to do anything further. You have already done more than I had any right to expect. If you want me to leave in the morning, I will leave. I will find another. You will sleep, Garrett said. It was not a dismissal. It was a fact being stated by a man who found the facts self-evident. Whatever you intend to do, you cannot do it well without rest, and what is coming tomorrow requires clear thinking from all of us. Cole looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he pulled out the nearest chair and sat in it facing the fire and said nothing further. Eli said goodnight with the quiet decency of someone who has grasped that the room has become more serious than he knows how to address and went upstairs. Adelaide picked up the ledger. She placed it back in the bag. She buckled both buckles. At the foot of the stairs, Garrett spoke. He said it quietly enough that for a moment she was not certain she had heard it correctly. You can trust us through one night. She did not turn around, but she stood very still for exactly one breath, holding those words with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered and that she was afraid might not survive careless handling. Then she continued up the stairs. The blizzard came before morning. By the time the first gray light of Wednesday found the windows of Harlow Ranch, the snow was at the sills, and Silver Creek was 4 miles away, and entirely unreachable, and a lie told in a public square by a man with amber eyes had already begun to become something more complicated than a lie. She had decided sometime in the long, dark hours before the storm arrived in full that she would leave before sunrise. The gray mare in the North Corral, the tree line north toward the ridge, distance between herself and this ranch and these 3 men who had not asked for any part of what she had walked into their lives carrying. She rose at 4 in the morning and dressed in the dark and buckled the bag. She moved through the hallway in her stockings with her boots in her hand, because she had become very good at leaving without sound. She came down the stairs and turned toward the door and stopped. Garrett Harlow was sitting at the table in the near dark with a single candle burned low beside him and a book open in front of him that he may or may not have been reading. He looked up when she appeared at the foot of the stairs. His amber eyes held of the quality of someone who has been awake for a long time and does not consider this remarkable. He looked at her coat, at the boots in her hand, at the bag on her shoulder. "Where are you going up?" he said. 3 words. She had been ready for many things: accusation, pursuit, confrontation, the particular kind of coercion that powerful men employ when the documents that threaten them are within reach. She had not been ready for 3 plain words spoken without anger or alarm by a man sitting in candlelight with a book in front of him, waiting for her with the calm of someone who expected her to appear and had simply not mentioned it. She did not have an answer. Outside, the snow came down in walls. The blizzard had arrived in earnest, and there was no leaving now. And both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. And in the silence between them, something settled that would take several more days to become visible and several more years to become what it was going to be. She set her boots down on the bottom step. She sat in the chair across the table from him. He did not say anything further. He turned a page. She folded her hands around the strap of the bag, and she waited for morning and outside the snow-covered Silver Creek Valley until the world was entirely white and still and ready, in the way that things are ready when they have been waiting a long time for what comes next. She did not know when she finally slept. Only that at some point the dark deepened around her, and Garrett said, without looking up from his book, that she should go upstairs, and her legs carried her there without further argument from the rest of her. The morning came in gray and absolute. Adelaide woke in the narrow bed at the end of the upstairs hall with the disorientation of someone who has spent enough consecutive nights in unfamiliar places that the body has ceased to expect consistency. For 3 or 4 seconds she did not know where she was. Then the smell of the room reached her wood smoke and coal pine and something faintly leathery, a working room in a working house, and it came back to her in sequence. Silver Creek, the square, the warrant, the 3 brothers, the man at the table in the dark who had asked her where she was going with 3 words and no accusation, and had somehow, without any further conversation, made the question impossible to answer. She lay still and listened. Wind, the sound of a storm that has committed to itself not gusting, but sustained a long continuous pressure against the north face of the building that told her everything she needed to know about the road between the ranch and town. She got up and crossed to the window and looked out, and the world had gone entirely white. The snow was not falling anymore. It had fallen. It had fallen all night with purposeful abundance, and the argument it had made was decisive. The fences were buried to their second rails. The barn was a dark shape in the general whiteness visible, but reduced its familiar lines, simplified by accumulation, into something almost abstract. The road north from the property, the road south towards Silver Creek, both of them had ceased to exist as roads and had become simply more of the same continuous white. She was not going anywhere today. She was not going anywhere for several days. She dressed carefully and buckled the bag and went downstairs and found the kitchen empty but warm. Someone had fed the fire recently. The wood box beside the hearth had been restocked. On the counter, a covered pot held the previous night's leftover beans, and there was a half loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. And on the shelf above the window, a row of tins that she examined with the systematic attention she brought to every new environment she had entered over the past 11 weeks. She put water on to boil. She found the coffee in the second tin and measured it by eye the way her father had taught her, because measuring by eye required you to pay attention to what you were doing rather than outsourcing the judgment to a spoon. She set the table for four. She put the bread on the cutting board and sliced it with the knife she found hanging beside the stove, and she began the work of inhabiting a space that did not belong to her, with enough competence and care that the people it did belong to would not regret her presence in it. Garrett came in from the barn at 6 and stopped in the doorway. The expression on his face lasted less than 2 seconds before his customary composure reasserted itself, but Adelaide caught it. Not surprise exactly, something slightly more interior than surprise. The look of a man who had formed an expectation and found it insufficient. He hung his coat and hat and began washing his hands at the basin. "You did not need to do that." "I know," she said. "The stove has a specific way it needs to be managed in weather like this. The left damper needs to come halfway down, or the draw reverses when the wind shifts." She adjusted the left damper. "Like that?" He looked at it. "Yes." He sat down. She poured the coffee and sat across from him, and they drank in the kind of silence that exists between two people who have not yet established the unspoken rules of each other's company, but have enough mutual intelligence to know that forcing conversation is a form of bad manners. Outside, the wind continued its long argument with the north wall. After a while, he said, "The storm will hold at least 2 more days, maybe 3. The temperature will drop again tonight." "Then we have time," she said. He looked up from the cup. "Time for what?" "To decide what we are going to do." A pause. He drank his coffee. "Yes," he said, "we do." Cole came in 20 minutes later, assessed the table setting with a flicker of something Adelaide chose to interpret as acknowledgement, and sat down without comment. Eli arrived behind him, still pulling on his left boot, looked at the breakfast that had been assembled and then at Adelaide with the open gratitude of a 24-year-old who has been eating his own brother's cooking for 5 years and recognizes an improvement. "Good morning," he said with the warmth of someone who means it genuinely and does not feel the need to be subtle about it. "Good morning," Adelaide said. Cole poured his coffee and did not say good morning. Adelaide noted this without resentment. She had grown up around a man who communicated most effectively through action and whose silences were not unfriendly, but were not conversational. And she understood that some people inhabited that mode as their primary one. She would wait. Things would become clear. After breakfast, Garrett went back to the barn with Eli to tend the livestock. Cole remained at the table. He had brought out a set of ranch ledgers from the office at the back of the main house and was working through them with the focused economy of a man for whom this was neither pleasure nor burden, but simply the work that needed to be done. Adelaide cleared the table around him. He moved his papers without being asked. She washed the dishes. She returned the kitchen to the condition it had been in when she found it, which she had memorized before altering it. Because She had learned that the fastest way to make yourself unwelcome in someone else's space was to fail to understand the logic of how they had arranged it. She sat in the chair by the window and opened the bag and removed the first ledger. Cole looked up. He looked at the ledger, then at her. He did not ask. I need to know what is in here well enough to reconstruct it from memory, she said. If something happens to the physical documents, I need to be the document. He held her gaze for a moment with the quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as his. Evaluative, not hostile, precise. Then he looked back at his own work. She opened the ledger and began to read. The first entry was dated 3 years and 4 months ago and concerned a land grant in the southern quarter of Montana Territory assigned to Sterling Pacific at a value of 11 cents per acre when the recorded market value for equivalent parcels in the same period was holding at 42 cents. Beside the official entry, her father had written a notation in his careful hand. The name of the federal land officer, the date of a dinner at a Philadelphia club, the amount charged to a Sterling Pacific expense account, described as hospitality and entertainment, which was a sufficiently vague category to pass without scrutiny in a general audit and sufficiently specific when you knew where to look to tell a very clear story. Her father had always known where to look. She read. The blizzard moved outside the window in its long, unhurried way. Cole turned pages and made notations. The fire held. The sound of Garrett and Eli returning from the barn brought the morning's first significant interruption at around 9:30. Garrett came in, stood the snow off his boots on the mat, and crossed to the stove. He stood there warming his hands without facing the room, and Adelaide watched his shoulders and thought about what it was to be a person who has built a life around him so completely with his own hands that the place where those hands end and the world begins has become genuinely difficult to locate. The east fence line came down in the night, he said to the room generally. 2 sections. The horses are fine. We will need to address it when the weather allows. How long? Cole asked. Day's work for 2 people, maybe less. Eli emerged from behind him, carrying his hat shaking snow from his hair, with the enthusiasm of a bite after a swim. He saw Adelaide by the window with the ledger and recalibrated his energy downward with visible effort. Good morning again, he said more quietly. She found herself almost smiling. The days had a shape. They began before light with Garibest already present in whatever room Adelaide entered, coffee made or fire stoked, or bread set out as though he had preceded her there not through design but through the simple fact of requiring less sleep than other people. She would join him in the quiet, and they would begin the morning's domestic work in parallel. 2 people who had established without discussing it a division of effort that made sense given what each of them knew how to do. Garrett and Eli managed the animals. The horses required particular attention in the kind of cold that had settled over the valley water troughs, breaking overnight and needing to be cleared before the animals could drink feed, requiring transport through deep snow that resisted every step. Adelaide watched Garrett work through the kitchen window on the second morning and thought about the quality of effort required to maintain a living thing in conditions designed by nature to be hostile to maintenance. And she thought about her father's patience at his desk in the small hours, and she understood that the 2 things were not as different as they appeared. She went out to help. Garrett heard her boots on the snow behind him before she reached the water trough. He turned and looked at her coat buttoned to the collar gloves, on a look on her face that preempted any suggestion that she return inside. He moved to give her room at the trough and handed her the smaller of the 2 implements. She worked beside him without speaking. The cold was the kind that registers not as a temperature, but as a presence, a thing with weight and intention. She kept working, he kept working. Neither of them acknowledged the shared effort as anything other than what it was, which was the straightforward task of keeping water available for horses that depended on them. When they went back inside, he said, "You have done this before." "No," she said, "but I have done things like it." He nodded as though this was a satisfactory answer. She supposed for a man like Garrett Harlow it was. It was on the second afternoon that it happened. The thing that Adelaide would think of afterward as the moment when Cole's mathematics began to change. She had finished her review of the first ledger and was making a notation of her own in the small notebook she kept inside the bag, a running index of the most significant entries in case she ever needed to direct someone to a specific page quickly. She had done this because her father had taught her that information, however complete, was only as useful as its accessibility, and that the work of organizing it was as important as the work of gathering it. Cole was at the table with the ranch ledgers working through the previous year's accounts, with the concentrated attention that Adelaide had come to understand was simply how he occupied space. He did not hum or shift or look out the window. He worked. She glanced across the table. He had 3 ledgers open in front of him, current year, and the 2 preceding. She had not meant to read them. She had simply glanced. The automatic reflex of a person trained since childhood to notice numbers, and in the 3 seconds of casual observation, she saw something. She looked more carefully. She said nothing for a moment. She picked up her own pencil and worked through the calculation in the margin of her notebook because she did not want to say something she could not prove. The calculation took 4 minutes. She checked it twice. Cole, he looked up, the cattle buyer you have been using. Hendricks on the south end of the county. A pause, revise. Yes. He has been adding a transaction fee to your final invoice. Not itemized. Embedded in the price per head at a level below what a quick review would catch. The difference between the going rate for prime cattle in this region over the last 3 years and what you have been receiving is not seasonal variation. She turned her notebook around so he could see it. It is 17 cents per head consistently across 41 separate invoices. That is $280 over 3 years. Cole looked at the notebook. He looked at his ledger. He looked at the notebook again. He reached across the table without speaking and took the notebook and set it beside the open ledger and began going through the figures line by line, not rushing with the same methodical care he brought to everything. The fire went through its adjustments. Adelaide waited. "Show me," he said eventually. She pulled her chair around to his side of the table. She showed him, not quickly, not impatiently. She walked him through each entry the way her father had walked her through columns as a child, treating the numbers as a text to be read rather than a calculation to be performed, each figure carrying its meaning in context and not in isolation. Cole listened. He asked 2 questions, good questions, questions that cut directly to the points where her evidence was strongest and tested whether the pattern was real or constructed. She answered them honestly, including the one place where the discrepancy was small enough to have been coincidental, which she identified before he raised it. After a long silence, he sat back in his chair. He did not look at her. He looked at the ledgers. "Your father taught you this," he said. "From when I was 10 years old," she said. Eli had appeared at some point in the proceedings and was now sitting on the edge of the hearth with his elbows on his knees watching the scene with the focused attention he generally reserved for situations that were more significant than they initially appeared. "She found it in 6 minutes," Eli said. 6, give or take. Cole did not respond to this directly. He was still looking at the ledgers. Something had shifted in the quality of his attention to the woman sitting beside him, not the warmth that Eli brought instinctively to most things, but something measured and real. The acknowledgement of a man who takes competence seriously and has just encountered it in an unexpected form. "We will need to address this with Hendricks," he said. "You have sufficient documentation to do so," Adelaide said. "The pattern is consistent enough to preclude accident." Cole nodded once. He closed the ledger. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is revising a calculation and wants to be precise about it. "You should look at the supply accounts when you have time," he said. He pushed them across the table to her and went back to his own work. She understood this was a significant thing. She returned it with the same currency, which was simply to begin. That night, Eli told stories about Silver Creek. He told them the way certain people tell stories, not performing them, but inhabiting them, aiming into the parts that were funny with a timing that seemed natural rather than practiced. He told them about the summer a traveling preacher had tried to establish a temperance society in a town that contained a functioning saloon and 3 independent whiskey operations, and about the winter a mountain lion had been found sleeping in the back room of the general store, and about the ongoing disagreement between two families on the eastern end of the county whose original dispute had been definitively resolved a decade ago, but who had developed such an investment in the argument itself that they continued it on principle. Adelaide laughed. Not the polite, contained sound she had used in Philadelphia drawing rooms, where laughter was a social instrument deployed with care. She laughed the way she had laughed when she was 12 years old, and her father made a particularly well-constructed pun at the dinner table, and then looked at her with his scholar's expression, pretending it had been entirely unintentional. It came from the same place that had been locked since October and had found its key without her noticing. She heard it and was briefly startled by it. Garrett was reading. He did not look up, but she noticed that he had not turned a page in several minutes. The coat happened on the second afternoon. She found it hanging on the peg nearest the door, the heavy working coat that Garrett wore for the barn and the outside work, and she noticed with the automatic attention of a person who had spent her life observing things that the right shoulder seam had come loose by about 2 inches. Not consequential yet. Consequential in a week if weather continued to require the coat daily and no one addressed it. She did not ask. She found the sewing kit she had carried from Philadelphia in the side pocket of the bag, which contained thread of the appropriate weight and color because her father had packed it for her in the year she turned 16 and had explained without sentiment that needlework was a practical skill and not a gender-specific one, and that he expected her to know how to do it correctly. She sat in the chair by the window and she repaired the seam. The stitching took 20 minutes. When she was done, it was tight and even and matched the original construction closely enough that you would need to be looking for it to find where the new work began. She hung the coat back on the peg. She did not mention it. That evening when Garrett came in from the later barn check and took the coat down to hang by the fire for the morning, she saw him stop. He held the shoulder seam between 2 fingers for a moment. He ran his thumb along the new stitching. He hung the coat where it needed to be and turned back to the room with the same expression he generally brought to everything which contained nothing superfluous and a great deal that was not visible. He did not say anything about it, but the next morning he put his coffee cup down at exactly the place she had set it, rather than at the position he normally preferred, which she had noted on the first morning was 2 inches further from the edge, and she understood this as a kind of communication in the language they were developing, which was not verbal. On the second night, Adelaide was sitting with the third ledger when Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway after midnight. She had been unable to sleep and had come downstairs with the familiar bag and settled at the table with the lamp turned low. And she had heard the floorboards of the upper hallway and had thought it was Garrett and had been mildly surprised when Cole appeared instead. He was holding something, a piece of paper folded twice, slightly worn at the creases in the way of something carried in a pocket for several days. He set it on the table in front of her and took the chair across from her and said nothing. She unfolded it. It was a notice, printed on good stock in the clean typeface of a company that had the means to print its communications well. The Sterling Pacific Railroad Corporation, in coordination with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, was offering a reward of $5,000 for information leading to the recovery of certain proprietary documents currently in unauthorized possession. The documents were described in general terms. The description was accurate, $5,000. Adelaide refolded the paper along its existing creases and placed it back in front of Cole. "Where did you find this?" she said. "County office board," he said. "The day we went into town. I took it down before we reached the square." She waited. "I have been looking at the ranch accounts," he said. The lamp between them held its steady light. "I know what we owe and what we are carrying and what the margin is. I know what $5,000 would do." He looked at the paper, not at her. I have been thinking about it. I know, she said. He looked up then. I saw you, she said, twice the way you looked at the bag. She kept her voice even, not accusatory, factual. You are a man who does his mathematics, and $5,000 is a real number, and I am a complication you did not ask for. That is an honest assessment of the situation, he said. Then let me offer you an honest assessment of the alternative. She placed her hands flat on the table, a gesture she had inherited from her father, who used it when he wanted to signal that what followed was not argument, but information. If you send a message to Greer and he comes for the bag, I do not go to a courthouse. There is no trial. Franklin Sterling has no interest in a trial because a trial creates a record and a record creates risk. I disappear. The ledgers disappear, and the 712 families my father documented, the ones who lost their land to practices identical to what was done to your family, they never received the accounting that is owed to them. She paused. And Garrett and Cole and Eli are witnesses to a situation that someone like Sterling does not prefer to have witnesses to. I am telling you this not to frighten you, but because you are a man who does his arithmetic and you deserve to have all the figures before you arrive at an answer. Cole looked at the table for a long time. Outside, the blizzard moved through its long night. The lamp held. 712 families, we said, documented. The actual number is likely higher. Another silence. Caldwell, he said, not a question. He was thinking something through, following a thread. He was using the same pattern, Adelaide said, the same method of using legal mechanisms to accomplish illegal seizure. The practice is not original to Sterling, but Sterling refined it. He made it into a system, and then he made the system teachable, and men like Caldwell learned it. She looked at him steadily. Your father was not an accident. He was a consequence of a much larger design. Cole picked up the paper. He looked at it for what might have been 30 seconds. Then he folded it again and turned to the fire beside them and held one corner to the embers at the grate's edge until the paper caught. He held it until the flame reached his fingertips, and then he let it go, and they watched it complete itself in the grate, and it was gone. He stood up from the table. There is a seam coming loose on the left leg of the barn trousers on the second hook, he said. The brown ones, if you have the thread for it. He went back upstairs. Adelaide sat for a while longer in the kitchen with the lamp and the ledgers and the sound of the wind pressing against the building from the north. She thought about her father and his lamplight and the patience required to document a truth that no one with power wanted documented. She thought about three brothers in a cold house in a Wyoming winter and the way that one of them had just chosen something she would not forget. She thought about Garrett at the table in the dark asking her where she was going. She thought about this for a long time. The window scene happened on the third afternoon when the blizzard had dropped to a steady, heavy snowfall rather than the driving wall of the first 2 days, and the light through the glass was a cleaner gray than it had been. Eli was doing something in the barn. Cole was at the table with the accounts. Adelaide was at the window. She had been standing there longer than she intended, looking at the snow on the fields and thinking about her father's phrase that snow made the world clean again, and thinking about what clean meant when you were carrying what she was carrying and whether the word applied to anything she was likely to experience again. She heard Garrett close his book. She heard him cross the room. He came and stood beside her at the window, not close enough to crowd, close enough to share the view. He said nothing initially, which was entirely consistent with how he occupied space, and she found that she did not feel the need to fill it. After a while, she said, he used to say that snow made the world clean again, my father. He said it every winter, the first real snow, as though he were saying it for the first time. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Maybe it looked different to him every time, depending on what the year had held. She thought about this. Yes, she said, that is probably it. Another silence. Then she asked it because she had been carrying the question since the square and had been waiting for the right silence to set it in. The real reason, not the warrant or the jurisdiction. Why you stepped out. He took longer with this than she expected, and she had expected him to take long. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she had noticed before when he talked about the ranch itself, the same care given to naming what is difficult to name. 5 years ago, he said, a man named Caldwell wanted our land, not because he needed it particularly, because acquiring it would consolidate a section he found convenient, and he had the money and the connections to make the acquisition, and the only obstacle was the fact that my father had not agreed to sell. He looked at the snow. Caldwell paid someone to plant 3 head of branded cattle in our corral. My father was arrested for theft. The county sheriff at the time was a man who owed Caldwell a considerable favor. A pause. He died in the jail cell 3 months after the arrest. We were preparing an appeal. We did not have enough time. She did not say she was sorry. He had the quality of a man who had heard that word applied to this particular fact often enough to have lost the utility of it. Instead, she asked, Caldwell was prosecuted eventually. 2 years later, he said, he paid a fine. He kept the land. She turned to look at Ott, then the profile of his face against the window light, the jaw that held its tension quietly rather than displaying it. And that is how you know what you were looking at in the square. I know how it works when money uses the law for something the law was not made to do, he said. I know the shape of it. And I know what it case when no one steps in front of it. A silence of a different kind, not the comfortable silence of 2 people sharing something without needing to describe it. A weighted silence, the kind that holds what was not said between the things that were. Then he said something she had not expected. I wrote that advertisement because I needed practical help with this ranch. That was a true thing and it remains true. But the person I did not account for was someone who arrived carrying something heavier than I had arranged for and had not in 11 weeks put it down. She turned to look at him more directly. Most people, he said, choosing the words with the same care he gave everything, set down the things that are heavy when the weight becomes sufficient. It is a rational response. He turned from the window to look at her the first time in the conversation, and his eyes had the quality she was beginning to understand as simply how he saw things, direct and without performance. You have not set it down. I cannot, she said. I know. He returned his gaze to the snow. That is what I saw in the square. She stood beside him for a moment longer without speaking. Then she said, your father would have done the same thing with the ledgers if he had found them. He was quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. Yes, he said, he would have. On the 4th morning, the snow stopped. The sky cleared with the sudden finality that Wyoming skies employed as though a decision had been made and implemented without consultation. The light that came through the windows was the hard blue white of winter sun on fresh snow, brilliant and without warmth, the kind of light that makes everything look resolved, whether it is or not. Clarence Mills arrived at 10:30. He came from the direction of the Silver Creek Road on his elderly gray horse, which he treated with more confidence than the animal's condition warranted, and which arrived at the Harlow gate at a pace that suggested ongoing negotiation between horse and rider regarding the appropriate level of effort for the conditions. Mills himself was a man of 55 who conducted his ranching operation as a secondary enterprise to his primary occupation, which was comprehensive knowledge of the affairs of his neighbors. He was not malicious. He was simply constitutionally incapable of possessing information without distributing it. He said to check on the Harlow boys after the storm. This was plausible and also almost certainly not the primary reason. Garrett met him at the gate with the economy of a man managing an engagement he would prefer to minimize. He stood between Mills and the house by the natural arrangement of their positions and addressed the man's questions with the minimum responses required by social convention, which in his case was very minimum indeed, it might have held. Adelaide came out the side door for the water barrel at the east end of the porch at 10 because the main kitchen barrel was running low, and she had assessed the outdoor barrel as the nearest practical source. Mills saw her before Garrett could redirect. The older man's eyes moved over her with the quick inventory of someone who has spent a lifetime cataloging the details of others against the moment when they might become useful or interesting. He tipped his hat with the reflexive courtesy of a man who performs courtesy automatically regardless of its sincerity. "Morning, ma'am." "Good morning," she said with the Philadelphia composure she could summon, like a garment smooth and complete and giving away nothing. Mills stayed another 15 minutes. He asked 3 questions about stock conditions after the blizzard, 2 questions about the fence line, and 1 question about supply routes during heavy snow, all of which Garrett answered with the efficiency of a man who has decided that brevity is the most effective available discouragement. Mills watched Adelaide return to the house with the water. He watched Garrett's face while he watched her. He noted both observations for future reference. When he rode away toward the Silver Creek Road, Garrett stood at the gate and watched him go until he was no longer visible. Cole appeared from the barn. He looked at his brother's posture and then in the direction the horse had gone and arrived at his conclusion without requiring an explanation. "Tonight," he said. "By morning at the latest," Garrett said. He turned toward the house and his face had the quality of a man who has just confirmed the calculation he had been running since the storm began and found the answer was what he expected. Eli came up beside them. He had been in the barn and had missed the exchange with Mills by minutes. He looked at both his brothers, then toward the road where the hoof prints in the snow were already the only evidence Mills had been there. "What did I miss?" he said. "The next part of this," Garrett said, and went inside. The 4 of them sat together that evening with the silence of people sharing a confined space and a shared understanding of something approaching. The fire was high, the food was good, Adelaide having found a store of dried beans and smoked meat in the root cellar, and combined them with a competence that suggested her father's kitchen lessons had covered more than accounting. The snow outside had settled into the permanent blue shadow of deep winter twilight, and the sky beyond the windows was acquiring its stars one at a time in the cold, dry air. Garrett said, "Mills will be in town before tomorrow morning if the road holds." "It will hold," Cole said. "The overnight temperature will crust it." Then Barrett hears everything Mills saw, which is enough for Greer to come back out here with sufficient documentation that Barrett cannot hold him off again. Adelaide set her cup down. She had been waiting for this. She had been feeling the geometry of it shifting toward this shape since the snow stopped. "I can leave before morning," she said. "The gray mare, the North Trail. I have done it in worse conditions." 3 men looked at her. None of them spoke immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. Eli spoke first. "The North Trail is 4 feet under. The gray is not a mountain horse." He said it gently the way he said most things. "I know a road through the low ground that stays sheltered," she said. Garrett said nothing. He was looking at the fire. Cole said, "And if you get through, then what? Where does this road end?" "Cheyenne," she said. "The marshal's office. If I can get the documentation in front of a federal officer with no connection to Sterling's network, the warrant dissolves and the investigation begins. And the chance of reaching someone genuinely independent of Sterling's network in Cheyenne is what Cole said." She did not answer immediately because the honest answer was not as certain as she wished it were. Garrett said no. One word, flat and final. Adelaide looked at him. "You are not going anywhere in the dark on a mountain trail in December." He turned from the fire. His eyes were direct and without argument, the eyes of a man who has made a decision and is not presenting it for revision. "Whatever is coming, we meet it here. On ground we know, with time to prepare." He looked at his brothers. Cole was quiet. Eli was straight-backed in his chair with the look of someone who has stopped pretending to be the youngest and least consequential person in the room. Garrett looked back at Adelaide. "We have tomorrow. We use it." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind had returned, but lightly, a low sound rather than a pressure, and the fire moved with it in small adjustments. She thought about the 2 months of roads and stagecoaches and unfamiliar rooms, and the loneliness of a person who has made themselves into a moving target because stillness is dangerous. She thought about what it meant that three men in a Wyoming ranch house had just without conferring or contriving arrived at the same answer to a question she had posed. All right, she said. They stayed at the table a while longer after supper, and outside the stars were fully deployed now, in the cold black sky of the high country, and inside the fire made its good work. Eli told a story that was shorter than his usual ones, and it ended it with a line that made Cole, against all apparent intention, produce the approximation of a smile. Adelaide drank her coffee and listened to the sound of three brothers in a room they have inhabited long enough to be part of it, and she thought about her father's kitchen on Sunday evenings when the accounts were done and the lamplight was warm and the world outside was of only secondary importance. She thought about the four riders that would be coming up that road. She thought about what she intended to do when they arrived. She put her cup down, she went upstairs with the tea, and she set it at the foot of the bed, and she did not open it. She lay down in her clothes in the dark and looked at the ceiling of the room that had been built by a father she had never met for sons she had not expected to meet this way. And she thought that some things could not be planned, and some things could not be predicted, and some things arrived in your life dressed as disasters and turned out to be something else entirely. She was still deciding what this was when she fell asleep. In the hour before dawn on the fifth day, Garrett stood at the bedroom window in the gray pre-dawn cold and looked at the road below. Nothing yet. Just the snow and the dark and the patient stillness of a ranch in deep winter that had been maintained and would continue to be maintained because the people who maintained it had no intention of doing otherwise. He looked for a long time. Then he turned from the window and went downstairs to make the coffee and feed the fire and wait. The way he had been waiting for most of his adult life for whatever was coming to arrive so he could face it straight on, which was the only direction he had ever been capable of facing anything. The sun came up pale and brilliant over the eastern ridge, and from the upstairs window in the growing light, four riders appeared on the crest of the hill above the south road, moving slowly toward Harlow Ranch, with the deliberate pace of people who have all the time they need and know it. Garrett saw them at the same moment Adelaide appeared at his shoulder. She had been awake. Of course she had been awake. She did not ask if they were going to run. He did not offer the option. They stood together at the window and watched the riders descend, and Garrett said quietly and without drama, the way he said all consequential things, "Wake Cole and Eli." She was already turning for the door. The four riders came down the hill in single file. Adelaide watched them from the top of the stairs while she buttoned her coat with fingers that moved steadily because she had decided sometime in the hour before dawn, while lying awake in the dark above a house that had begun to feel like something she recognized, that whatever happened today, she would not let her hands betray her. Her father had kept his hand steady at his desk in the last weeks of his life when he had known what he was documenting and what it would cost. She could do the same. She came down the stairs to find all three brothers already in the main room. Garrett was at the window. Cole was pulling on his second glove. Eli was standing very still near the door. With the quality of attention he had been carrying since the previous night, the quality of a young man who has assessed the situation and arrived at a position he does not intend to vacate. Nobody spoke immediately. They had said what needed saying the night before. Garrett turned from the window. He looked at Adelaide with the directness that was simply how he saw things, not an assessment so much as an acknowledgement. "You should go," he said. "The gray mare, North Trail, you have enough light now and the crust will hold for 3 hours." It was not a command. It was an offering made with the same clean honesty he brought to everything, which meant it was genuine and meant she was free to take it, and he would not think less of her if she did. She said no. He looked at her. "Oh, I have been running since October," she said. 8 states, 11 weeks. Every morning, I woke up in a different room, and every night I fell asleep listening for footsteps in the hall." She held his gaze with the same steadiness she was demanding from her hands. "I am not running today." "Adelaide, I have something today that I have not had in 11 weeks, she said. I am not walking away from it. Eli from near the door, what do you have? She looked at him, then at Cole, who was watching her with the focused quality of a man reaching the end of a calculation, then back at Garrett. People standing beside me, she said. The room held that for a moment. Cole pulled his second glove the rest of the way onto his hand. Then let us go and stand beside you, he said, and opened the door. Garrett looked at his brother, then at Eli, who had already taken a step toward the door with the resolute energy of someone who has been waiting to act and finds the waiting is finally over. Then at Adelaide, who had picked up the bag from where it had sat at the foot of the stairs and was holding it the way she always held it with both hands, with the knowledge of what it contained and what that meant. He took his coat from the hook. He held the door. The four of them walked out into the cold blue morning together. The snow on the porch had been swept but not completely cleared, and their boots compressed it as they took their positions toward it at the front of the three steps that descended to the yard, Cole to his left, Eli to his right. Adelaide stood at Garrett's shoulder. She had thought about where to stand and had decided that standing beside him, rather than behind him, was the honest answer to the question of where she actually was in this situation, which was not waiting to be protected but choosing to be present. The four riders reached the gate and stopped. Barrett was in front. He sat his horse with the posture of a man carrying something heavier than the ride required, the posture of someone who has examined his instructions and his conscience and found them pointing in different directions and has not yet resolved the disagreement. His face in the winter morning light was the face of a man in his late 40s who looks his age and does not apologize for it. Behind him came Greer, the expensive coat looking less incongruous in daylight than it had in the square, and behind Greer, two men whose faces Adelaide had not been able to see clearly at the square and could see clearly now. They were the kind of men whose faces did not particularly require seeing. Their function was visible in how they held themselves. Barrett dismounted and walked to the gate with his hands away from his coat in the manner of a man signaling that he is not looking for a confrontation while making clear that he is prepared for one. Greer remained mounted for a moment and then dismounted as well with the deliberate pace of someone accustomed to letting other people go first into situations whose safety has not been established. Harlow, Barrett said, his voice carried across the yard with the quality of someone speaking outdoors in cold air slightly louder than necessary indoors and exactly right for the distance. Sheriff, Garrett's voice from the top of the steps was what it always was, level, without elaboration. I have an updated warrant, Barrett said, confirmed through the marshal's office in Cheyenne via telegram last night. Whatever the questions were about the original document, they have been addressed at a higher level. He reached into his coat and produced the paper. He held it up. I need Miss Hayes to come with me. Greer stepped forward from behind him. He had the look of a man who has spent 2 days in a cold county waiting for this moment and is prepared to spend as much effort as necessary to make use of it. Miss Hayes, he said, with the precision of someone reading from a prepared statement, the warrant is confirmed by federal authority. This matter is concluded. Please step forward. Nobody moved. Greer's eyes went to the bag on Adelaide's arm. One of the two men behind him dismounted. He was the taller of the two, with hands that moved with the practiced awareness of someone for whom physical confrontation is a professional category rather than an exceptional occurrence. He walked toward the steps. Garrett came down one step, not toward the man's hands, not toward the weapon Adelaide could see outlined against his coat, toward the man himself, which was a different and more specific thing. He descended one step and stopped, and the effect of his standing there at that particular elevation, with that particular stillness and that particular size, was that the man had to make a choice about whether to continue. You are on private land, Garrett said. His voice had not changed in pitch or intensity. It remained what it always was. In front of a county sheriff. If you reach for that weapon on private land with no sworn authority to be here, you are the first person who commits a crime today. and not a small one. The man stopped. Barrett said without looking away from the exchange. Stand down. Both of you stand down. He let a moment settle. Harlow is correct about jurisdiction. My authority does not extend to yours, Greer. Your men remain civilian until I say otherwise. Greer's expression did not alter in any way that would have registered to a casual observer, but something shifted behind his eyes, not defeat. The controlled stillness of a man who has encountered resistance before and knows when to change his angle of approach rather than his destination. Barrett came through the gate. He walked up the path to the foot of the porch steps and stood there with the patient authority, of someone who is going to do what he came to do and is not going to be hurried about it. He looked at Adelaide. Miss Hayes, I am going to need to ask you to come with me. Adelaide came down the 3 steps. She walked past Garrett, who held his position. She walked past Barrett, which was not the direction Barrett had expected, and she walked to the middle of the open yard between the porch and the gate, and she stopped. She turned. She was not looking at Greer. She was not looking at the 2 men who had stepped back at Barrett's order. She was looking at Barrett himself, and the quality of her looking had the same quality as her father's pen moving across the ledger page. Precise, committed, without apology for what it was about to do. Sheriff Barrett, she said. Her voice in the cold morning air was clear and steady and carried to every person present without effort. Before you make any decision today, I need you to read something. She reached into the interior of her coat, not the bag. The coat pocket where she had placed a single sheet of paper before she came downstairs, separated from the ledgers, and held apart because it was the most important thing she carried, and she had decided that this morning she was going to place it in the hands of someone who could use it. It was the original letter. Her father had found it in the Sterling Pacific administrative files 3 weeks before his death, in a folder miscatalogued and overlooked because the person who had placed it there had expected it would never be retrieved. Edmund had photographed the page and then replaced the original, and he had brought the photograph home and placed it in an envelope and written his daughter's name on the outside and put it with the other things she was to have if something happened to him. The photograph was a clear and complete reproduction of a letter written on Sterling Pacific letterhead in a handwriting that the company's own records could verify belonged to Franklin Sterling himself. It was addressed to his operations manager, and it concerned certain necessary arrangements to be made regarding a specific situation in the Philadelphia accounting office before the 15th of October. The language was the language of a man who had long practice at saying things without saying them. But the meaning was not ambiguous to anyone who read it with the knowledge of what had happened on the 13th. Adelaide held it out to Barrett. He took it. He read. The yard was very quiet. The horses made their small sounds. The wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood along the north fence, with the thin sound of winter moving through things it has stripped of protection. Adelaide stood in the middle of the yard with the bag on her arm and her hands at her sides and did not look at Greer or at the 2 men behind him, or at the gate, or at the road. She looked at Garrett. He had turned on the steps to face her. He was standing with his coat open despite the cold, and his hands were at his sides, and his face held his ordinary expression, which was not closed and was not open, but was simply present fully and without reservation in the way of a man who has made his decision and does not need to continue making it. He was not watching Barrett. He was watching her. She thought he is not anxious. He is waiting, which is different. He came out here this morning knowing what might happen, and he has no plan to revise that decision, regardless of how the next several minutes resolve, and that is not stubbornness. It is something else. It is the certainty that belongs to people who act from something deep enough that circumstances cannot easily dislodge it. She thought about her father's hands on his pen in the lamplight. She waited. Barrett read for a long time, not because the letter was long, because he was the kind of man who read carefully, who did not form conclusions before the evidence had been fully assembled, who had in 23 years of difficult work maintained the habit of thinking before deciding which is rarer than it sounds and worth more than most people account for. When he finished, he did not speak immediately. He looked at the letter. He looked at Adelaide. He looked at the bag. He said, there is more documentation. 4 ledger books, she said. 3 years of ownership, names, dates, transaction amounts, and identifying notations for each party. Barrett put the letter carefully in his interior coat pocket. He turned to face Greer. Greer had been standing at the gate with the focused quiet of a man who knows when a situation is developing in a direction that requires patience. His expression was the expression of a professional who has not yet determined the outcome. Barrett said, "Greer, Sheriff, the letter I have just read describes the arranged death of a private citizen in the handwriting of the man who issued the arrangement, referencing a specific date that precedes by 2 days the date on which the citizen in question was found dead at the foot of a Sterling Pacific building." Barrett's voice had not changed in volume. It had changed in temperature. "The warrant in my possession was obtained through the office of the governor on the basis of a complaint filed by the Sterling Pacific Railroad Corporation. That complaint alleged theft of proprietary documents by this woman." He gestured toward Adelaide. "What I hold in my coat pocket suggests that the documents she is carrying are not proprietary corporate materials, but evidence of a premeditated killing committed to prevent their disclosure." A pause of 3 seconds. "That is a meaningfully different situation from the one I was presented with." Greer said, "Sheriff, you are a county officer and this is a federal matter. The documentation you have just reviewed is itself part of the unauthorized materials." "No," Barrett said. He said it without anger, which gave it more weight than anger would have. He reached into his coat and removed the warrant. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has been carrying something he should have examined it more carefully when it was handed to him. Then he tore it in half. He held the 2 pieces for a moment and then let them go, and the morning wind took them a short distance across the snow before they settled. The sound of that paper tearing was the only sound for 3 full seconds. Greer said very quietly, "You have just ended your career." "I have done the job I was hired to do," Barrett said, "which is to protect the people of this county from the application of unlawful force to unlawful ends." He looked at Adelaide. "Miss Hayes, with your permission, I will take the documentation you are carrying into my personal custody and transport it to the United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne today. The Marshal is a man I know personally and whose independence I can speak to." His voice carried the quality of a man choosing each word for precision rather than effect. "The investigation that follows will not be within my jurisdiction, but getting those documents to someone with the authority to act on them is." Adelaide looked at the bag. She looked at Garrett on the steps. He gave her nothing, no instruction, no direction, only the same steadiness he had offered all morning, which was itself the only instruction required. He trusted her to know what she was carrying and what it deserved and what it needed. She held the bag out to Barrett. He took it with both hands. Greer stepped forward. The 3 Harlow brothers came off the porch, not running, not aggressive. They moved the way Garrett moved, with the economy of men who have spent their lives in physical work and whose bodies know the difference between the motion that is necessary and the motion that is not. They placed themselves between Greer and Adelaide with the uncomplicated solidity of a fence that has been properly built. Greer stopped. He looked at the 3 men in front of him. He was not a coward and he was not a fool, and what he saw was not a threat but a fact. 3 men who had grown up on this land, who had built and repaired and defended it through 5 Wyoming winters without their father, who had buried that father and continued and would continue because the alternative was not something they were capable of choosing. Barrett said, "Mr. Greer, you and your associates will leave this property now. If I find in the course of my examination of these documents evidence of your knowing participation in the matters they describe, I will be in contact with the appropriate federal authorities. In the meantime, I am asking you to leave." Greer held for one more moment the professional's refusal to be visibly moved by anything short of force. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted with the same deliberate pace he did everything. The 2 men behind him exchanged a look and followed. At the gate, Greer paused. He turned in the saddle and looked at Adelaide with the expression of a man delivering a final assessment rather than a final threat. Sterling has resources that exceed the boundaries of what a county sheriff in a marshal's office can contain, he said. You should understand that. Garrett stepped forward. One step, just one off the packed snow of the yard onto the thin crust at the edge where the path ended. He was closer to Greer now than he had been since the square, and Greer was on horseback and Garrett was not. And it did not change the quality of the space between them, which had always been defined not by physical advantage, but by something less negotiable. She is not alone anymore, Garrett said, and we are harder to uproot than you are counting on. Cole came to stand at his left shoulder. Eli came to stand at his right. The three of them. In the cold morning light on the snow-covered ground of the ranch their father had built, standing in a line the way things stand when they have decided to stand. Greer looked at them for 3 seconds. Then he rode through the gate without looking back. Barrett watched the three men go until the sound of hooves had diminished into the distance of the white road. Then he turned to Adelaide. He held the bag with both hands carefully the way you hold something that has cost what this had cost. Miss Hayes, he said. She looked at him. I am sorry, he said, not the reflexive apology of a man covering his position. The real kind, which does not need ornamentation and does not receive it from a man like Barrett. About your father, about the warrant, about every part of this that was done wrong. He held the bag out to her. I would like you to walk me through what is in here before I take it to Cheyenne. I want to understand what I am carrying and what needs to be in front of the marshal first. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He looked at Garrett. Between them passed something that did not require words and did not get any the acknowledgement of two men who occupy different positions in the same structure and have, in this instance, found those positions pointing in the same direction. Then he turned to his deputies and said something quiet, and they walked with him to the side of the house where they could speak with Adelaide over the documents without the exposure of the yard, and Adelaide went with them, still carrying the bag. That left the three brothers standing in the snow. Eli exhaled slowly, a long breath that came out white in the cold air, and it seemed to contain a significant portion of the last several days in its release. He turned to Cole. Cole was looking at the gate where the riders had gone. His expression was the expression of a man who is not done calculating, but has arrived at a number he can work with. Eli said, You all right, Cole said. Ask me when it is over. It is over. Cole thought about this for a moment. Then he said, Ask me when the marshal's office confirms it. He turned and went back into the house. Eli looked at his oldest brother. Garrett was looking at the side of the house where Adelaide had gone with Barrett. His face held whatever it held, which Eli had spent enough years reading to know that he was not going to be able to name it precisely, but recognized as significant. I am going to go see about the horses, Eli said. He went. The conversation with Barrett took just under an hour. Adelaide walked him through the first ledger and the most critical entries, focusing on the officials whose names were recorded with sufficient detail to be identified and verified, and on the sequence of transactions that documented the pattern of land acquisition fraud across the territory, and on the specific entries that connected Sterling's operational decisions to their recorded outcomes. Barrett listened with the focused patience of a man who takes information seriously and does not pretend to understand what he has not yet understood, which is a rarer quality and authority than it should be. When it was done, he took the bag. He told her the process would take time. He told her that time was not an indicator of outcome. He told her that Edmund Hayes had done thorough work, the kind that held under examination, and that thorough work eventually produced results even when those results were slow. He rode out with his deputies at noon, and the sound of the horses faded into the silence of the valley, and then there was no sound at all except the wind and the horses in the barn and the absolute quiet of a Wyoming afternoon, when the cold has settled fully and everything has made its accommodation with it. Adelaide stood in the yard for a moment after they left. She looked at the road, at the snow in the valley, at the pale winter sky above the eastern ridge, at the mountains in the distance that she had been seeing from this property for 5 days now and had not yet finished looking at because they were the kind of thing that did not resolve into something you were done seeing. They only became more themselves the longer you looked. She heard the door. Garrett came out of the house and crossed the porch and came down the steps and stopped at the edge of the path. He had his coat on and his hat, and he stood the way he stood when he was outdoors with the ease of someone whose default orientation is toward open space rather than enclosure. He looked at the road, then at her. "You could go," he said. He said it quietly and without emphasis, the way he said things that were real rather than things that were designed to accomplish something. "Barrett has the documents. The process is started. There is no warrant. You are not required to be here." She turned to face him. She had been waiting for this, not dreading it, waiting for it with the attention she gave to things that mattered. "Is that what you want?" she said. He held her gaze with the steadiness that was not the product of effort, but simply of who he was. "I want you to choose," he said, "not because you have nowhere else to go, not because the road is difficult, because you want to be here." She looked at the ranch, at the house behind him with its stone chimney and its swept porch and its windows that had been lit against the cold every night she had been here, at the barn where the horses were, at the long fence line that ran to the east and the north and marked the boundary of something that had been built honestly and maintained at real cost and was still standing. She thought about Philadelphia, about the life she had inhabited before October, which had been a good life and was gone now. Not because she had left it, but because the people who had killed her father had unmade it, and the woman who had existed in it had become in 11 weeks of motion and cold, and the weight of 4 ledger books, someone different. Not worse. Different. Someone who had learned what she was made of because the circumstances had required her to find out. "My father used to say that this country was still being decided," she said, "what it was going to be, whether it was going to be fair or not." She looked at Garrett. "I came out here to disappear. That was the whole of my intention. I did not expect to find a reason to stop." "And now," he said, "now I have 4 reasons," she said. 3 of them have auburn hair or hazel eyes, or read at the kitchen table before anyone else is awake. And then there is the 4th one." She held his gaze. "I want to stay," she said, "not because I have no other option, because this is where I want to be." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. The light was at its flattest, the pale even light of a Wyoming afternoon in deep winter that gives everything equal illumination and no shadow, and makes the world look for a few hours exactly as it is and no more and no less. He reached into his coat and drew something out. Not from the pocket. He had been holding it in his hand inside the coat, which meant he had had it when he came out, which meant he had brought it with him when he came outside to find her. It was a ring, small and plain, a slender band with no stone, the kind of ring made for a working life rather than a display case. He held it without presentation, without ceremony, without any of the equipment that the occasion is supposed to require, because he was not a man for that kind of thing, and she had read 47 letters that had made this clear and would not have wanted him to become one. "I wrote the advertisement in June," and he said, "because I thought I needed a practical arrangement. That was a true thing. I am not going to pretend otherwise." His voice was what it always was, low, considered, meaning every word and using no others. "But I did not account for the possibility that the person who arrived might be someone who made me understand what I had been building this place without." He paused. The ring in his hand caught a point of winter light. "I am not a man who uses words carefully and then fails to mean them. When I said you were my bride in that square, I said it because it was the thing that needed to be said. I would like it if it is what you want to become the true thing." She looked at him. She thought about the kitchen table and the coffee and the coat and the window and the ledgers and the blizzard and the night at the bottom of the stairs when 3 words had made her unable to explain herself. She thought about what her father had said about trust, that you extended it not when you had certainty, but when you had enough. and that enough was a real category, even if it was not the same as everything. She held out her hand. He placed the ring on her finger with the same care he brought to the things that required it, in the same absence of performance. And then he kept her hand in his, and they stood there in the yard of Harlow Ranch in the cold afternoon, with the mountains above them, and the long winter ahead, and the quiet that exists between two people who have stopped negotiating and started. Cole appeared in the doorway of the house and looked at them for a moment. He did not say anything. He turned back inside. From the barn, Eli's voice came across the yard with the carrying quality it had in open air. Did something happen out there? Because I have been out here long enough to give the horses extra hay, and it feels like something happened. Garrett looked at Adelaide. She said something happened. Eli appeared in the barn doorway. He looked at them. He looked at their hands. He produced the expression that existed on his face alone, which was open and warm, and entirely unguarded and more honest about what it was feeling than most people managed in their best moments. Well, he said, good. He went back to the horses. Garrett did not let go of her hand. They stood in the yard as the afternoon light began its early winter withdrawal toward the western peaks, and the sky above the valley went from white to rose to the first gray blue of evening, and the cold deepened the way it deepens at altitude, when the sun retreats not gradually but in steps, each one clear and final. The lamp came on in the kitchen window. Cole had lit it. Adelaide watched the warm light appear into the glass against the darkening air and thought about her father's lamplight in the Philadelphia kitchen, the lamplight she had fallen asleep to as a child, the lamplight of a man who stayed up late because the work was worth doing and the doing of it mattered. She thought about the 4 ledger books that were on their way to Cheyenne in the saddlebag of a sheriff who had in the end done what a good man does, which is the right thing even when it is the difficult thing. She thought he would have liked this place. He would have liked the people in it. She did not say this aloud. She did not need to. She held it where she held most things that were important in the place she had learned to keep them safe, and she looked at the lamplight in the window and let herself, for the first time in 11 weeks, simply be somewhere she intended to remain. Garrett said, "It is getting cold." "Yes," she said, "we should go in." "Yes," she said, and they did. The word came back from Cheyenne in 6 days. A letter arrived at the Silver Creek post office addressed to Sheriff Holt Barrett, and Barrett rode out to the ranch on a Wednesday morning with the letter folded in his coat pocket and a look on his face that was not yet resolution, but was the beginning of it. He sat at the Harlow table and drank the coffee Adelaide poured him and told them what the letter said, which was that the United States Marshal for the Wyoming District had received the documentation, had reviewed the primary evidence, and had opened a formal federal investigation into the practices of the Sterling Pacific Railroad Corporation and its principals. Barrett put the letter on the table. He smoothed it once with the flat of his hand. "It will take time," he said. "These things always take time. Sterling has lawyers whose entire function is to extend the duration of time between a charge and its consequences." He looked at Adelaide. "But the documentation your father kept is the kind that holds. I have dealt with enough evidence in 23 years to know the difference between what holds and what does not. This holds." Adelaide looked at the letter on the table. She thought about her father at his desk, the lamplight, the careful hand moving across the page. "Thank you," she said. Barrett finished his coffee and stood. At the door he stopped and turned back the way a man stops when he has one more thing to say and is deciding whether to say it. He said it. "Your father was a good man. The work he did required a kind of courage that most people do not have to call on. I am sorry it cost what it cost." He put on his hat and rode back towards Silver Creek, and the sound of his horse diminished into the winter quiet of the valley, and what remained was the beginning of something different from what had come before. In January, Mayor Douglas Aldrich had submitted his resignation to the town council of Silver Creek, citing reasons of health. 2 county officials whose names appeared in Edmund Hayes's third ledger requested leaves of absence within the same week. The newspaper in Cheyenne ran a story in its 5th page that mentioned a federal investigation into land grant irregularities across the territory. It was a careful story, legally careful, the kind of story that does not name names until names have been confirmed in a way that survives challenge. But it was there. Silver Creek read it the way small towns read things collectively and with opinion. Cole went into town for supplies in February and came back with a report that could be summarized in his particular economy of language. As follows, the situation was being discussed. The discussion had become more complex, and a number of people who had not previously been interested in the Harlow family's affairs had recently discovered that they were. Hendricks sent word, Cole added, setting a supply bag on the kitchen table. About the accounts, he is prepared to discuss a settlement. Adelaide looked at him. I mentioned that we had documentation, Cole said in the same tone he used for everything. She did not smile, but something in her face acknowledged the information with a warmth that he received without comment and did not require to be named. Spring came to Silver Creek Valley the way it always came to High Country. Not gradually, but in sudden negotiations. A week of warmth, followed by a week of cold, followed by the definitive announcement of mud, and the first green edge appearing along the creek bed, and the horses moving differently in the yard, with the restlessness of animals that have endured winter and know it is ending. Adelaide planted a kitchen garden in the south-facing bed beside the house. She had not gardened before, not seriously, but she was a person who learned from paying attention rather than from being taught. And she paid attention to the soil and the light and the requirements of each thing she put in the ground with the same focused care she brought to the ledger columns. Garrett watched her from the barn door one morning and said nothing and went back to work. He said something that evening. He said the beans need more space between them. She said, I know, I moved them yesterday. He nodded and returned to the book he was reading, and that was the kind of conversation they had most often, short and accurate, and requiring nothing more than what it was. The wedding was in March. It was small and it was honest. The local minister, a man named Fletcher, who had been serving Silver Creek for 11 years and had developed the practical theology of someone who has administered to a frontier community long enough to understand that God in such places is primarily interested in people keeping their word, performed the ceremony in the church on the main street of town on a Saturday afternoon with the directness of a man who respects both the institution and the people entering it too much to waste their time. Cole stood at Garrett's left. He wore his good coat and his expression, which was the expression he wore when he was feeling something he had decided to contain, which meant it was visible to anyone who knew him and invisible to anyone who did not. Adelaide knew him. She could see in the set of his jaw and the quality of his stillness that he was holding something that had volume. Eli stood at Garrett's right and did not attempt to contain anything because containment was not his method. He wore the look of a person at the exact right place at exactly the right time, which was his most natural expression and also the most accurate one. There were perhaps 30 people in the church. Some of them had come because they knew the Harlow family. Some had come because Silver Creek was a small town and an event is an event. A few had come because the preceding weeks had produced a recalibration of their opinion of the woman at the front of the church and of the people she had come to stand beside. Adelaide wore a dress she had made from cloth, purchased in town, blue-gray, the color of the mountains, when clouds are moving across them, practical enough for the life ahead, and considered enough for the occasion. She carried no flowers. Her hair was up, and a strand of it had escaped as it always did at her left temple. Garrett looked at her when she came down the aisle the way he looked at things that required his full attention completely and without performance. Minister Fletcher said the words. Garrett said the words required of him. Adelaide said the words required of her. Neither of them looked away from the other while saying them. Outside afterward, in the cold March air, Eli shook his brother's hand with the force of a man expressing something he does not have adequate language for and is using physical communication to convey. Cole shook Garrett's hand once briefly and then turned to Adelaide and extended his hand to her in the same direct way, and she took it and he held it for a moment and looked at her with the expression she had first seen at the kitchen table when she showed him the Hendricks accounts, the expression of a man who has revised a significant calculation and found the new number more accurate, Then he let go and turned back toward the street because he was Cole and sentiment had its limit, and the limit was approximately right there. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, with the mountains turning gold on their upper faces and the valley floor in shadow, and Garrett held the reins with one hand and kept the other hand where it had been since they left the church, which was around Adelaide's, and neither of them said much because there was not much that the day had left unsaid. That night, a fire burned in the hearth at Harlow Ranch. Cole and Eli made themselves scarce with the consideration of brothers who understand when a space belongs to two people and not more. The door of the main bedroom closed softly. Outside, the first stars of the March night appeared above the eastern ridge, cold and clear, and very far away, and the mountain held its patience the way mountains do, which is permanent. The years move the way years move when they are built on honest work and shared difficulty, and the accumulated ordinary weight of two people becoming so familiar with each other that the seams of the original selves begin to be absorbed into something larger and less easy to describe. The summer Eli met Nora Walsh, the blacksmith's daughter Adelaide spent 3 afternoons teaching him to write letters that were not the letters he normally wrote, which were functional and accurate, and did not contain the kind of sentence that a young woman in Silver Creek might read and then read again. She taught him this the way her father had taught her things, by requiring him to think about the person receiving the letter as a specific individual rather than a general audience, and what that specific individual might find worth reading twice. Eli's letters improved considerably. Nora Walsh eventually replied to one of them at greater length than strictly necessary. The winter of 1877 into 1878 brought the first child, a boy born in December in the bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall where Adelaide had slept on her first night at the ranch. Garrett named him Edmund, which was a decision he made without discussion, because it was not a decision that required it. Cole and Eli heard the name and received it without comment because it was correct and they knew it. In 1880, a federal court in Philadelphia returned a verdict in the matter of the Sterling Pacific Railroad Corporation in certain of its principles. Franklin Sterling was convicted on 14 counts. The proceedings had lasted 3 years and had required the testimony of 8 separate witnesses and the submission of documentation running to several hundred pages, the core of which remained 4 small ledger books maintained in a careful hand by a man named Edmund Hayes, who had understood that truth to survive must be documented with care. The Cheyenne newspaper ran the verdict on its front page. Adelaide read the article twice at the kitchen table alone in the early morning before anyone else was up. She folded the paper along its crease and put it in the cedar box she kept at the back of the wardrobe, which contained certain things she intended to keep. Then she made the coffee and set the table for the morning. In 1883, a sickness moved through the cattle herds of the Western Territory, and the Harlow herd was not spared. They lost 2/3 of the animals by November. Garrett and Cole sat with the accounts and the losses and the available options for 3 evenings before arriving at the plan, which was difficult and was going to require several years of constrained operation and was going to work. Adelaide contributed to the accounting sessions as she had contributed to everything since the Hendricks discovery, which is to say, completely and without requiring the contribution to be acknowledged before she made it. On the 3rd evening, she put down her pencil and said, "We have enough." 2 words. Cole looked at the figures, then he looked at her, and then he said, "Yes." And that was the end of the bad years. The good years accumulated in the way that good years do, less dramatically than the difficult ones, less available to being pointed at as individual events and more visible in aggregate in the slow expansion of the ranch and the fence lines and the family. A second child came in 1879, a third in 1884. The house gained a room and then another room, and then a porch along its entire south face that Garrett built over the course of one autumn with the same patient competence he brought to everything he put his hands to. Eli married Nora Walsh in 1879. They built a house at the north end of the property close enough that the smoke from their chimney was visible from the main house on still mornings. Cole married later in 1882, a widow from the Laramie Basin with 3 children of her own, and the kind of directness that Cole found after initial resistance to be among the most appealing qualities a person could have. The valley over the years began to be called by a name it had not originally had. People said Harlow Valley with the ease of a name that has earned its place, referring not to any official designation, but to the way a particular stretch of Wyoming had been shaped by the people who had decided to shape it. It was the morning of the 15th of September, 1904. The sun came over the eastern ridge at 6:15 and found Garrett Harlow standing on the porch of the main house with a coffee cup in his hand, looking out at the valley the way he had looked out at it every morning for 28 years, with the attention of a man who finds in a familiar view not sameness, but a continuous conversation. He was 60 years old. His hair had gone gray at the temples and silver along the part, and his hands had the accumulated record of the work they had done, and he moved in the morning cold with the slight deliberateness of a body that has carried its weight for long enough to have learned the value of not rushing what does not need to be rushed. Adelaide came out with the second cup. She was 51. There was silver in her honey hair now, threads of it that caught the morning light, way she had stopped noticing because she had stopped looking at herself the way she had once been accustomed to, and had started looking outward instead at the valley and the mountains and the faces of the people she had built her life beside. Her eyes were the same blue. They had always been clear and focused, and they had added to their depth a quality that eyes acquire through decades of paying attention to things that matter. She gave him the cup and stood beside him. From the yard behind the house came the sound of children. Edmund's two, aged 5 and 3, who had been brought over the previous evening and were now conducting some enterprise in the vicinity of the fence that involved considerable noise and no apparent injury. Edmund himself was 26 and had his father's coloring and his mother's habit of arriving at conclusions by examination rather than assumption. His wife Clara was visible through the kitchen window of the guest cabin, where a lamp was already burning against the early morning cool. Garrett wrapped one arm around Adelaide's shoulders and they stood together looking at the valley in the early light. "Do you remember the square?" he said. She did not ask which square or which day. "I remember every second of it," she said. "I still do not know exactly what I was thinking." "You were not thinking," she said. "That was the point. You saw what was happening and you acted. There was not enough time for thinking." Most people would say that is not a good basis for the decisions that follow from it. She looked at him with the look she had developed across 28 years of looking at him, which contained more information than most people convey in a conversation. "Most people have not read your 47 letters," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. She had been making him do that since December of 1876, and she intended to continue. From the yard, the younger child called out. She called again more insistently. The call of a small person who has discovered something requiring immediate adult attention. Adelaide finished her coffee. "That is our cue," she said. They walked off the porch together and across the yard in the September morning, and the mountains were in their full autumn color. Above the valley, the aspens turned, and the high meadows bronzed, and the sky above it was the blue that the high country produced in the good weeks of September, when the summer heat had gone and the winter had not yet committed. She had thought about this, not constantly, but she returned to it sometimes the way you return to a thought that has not finished resolving the long chain of it, from a stagecoach arriving in a gray afternoon to this morning in this yard with this man beside her and these grandchildren calling from the fence. Her father had said that this country was still being decided, what it was going to be, whether it was going to be fair. She thought about the ledger books in the cedar box upstairs. She thought about the men whose names were in them and what had become of those names. She thought about the 700 families her father had documented, the ones whose land had been taken by a system that was supposed to protect them, and she thought about the federal verdict and the long, slow work of restitution that had followed it, imperfect and incomplete and real. She thought about fairness, which was not the same as happiness, and about justice, which was not the same as resolution, and about what it meant to be part of a life that had contributed something, however small, to the ongoing argument between what the world was and what it could be. Edmund Hayes had kept his accounts faithfully and had paid the full price for keeping them. She had carried them west and had not set them down. And a man she had read 47 letters from had looked at her across a town square and had known, from the way two other men were watching, something she held, that she needed someone to stand beside her. She still did not know if this was fate or coincidence or something with no name that simply happened in the way some things happen without architecture or announcement, two people in the same place at the same moment finding each other necessary. She supposed it did not matter what you called it. It mattered that it had happened. It mattered that they had let it. The younger grandchild had located a frog in the fence post vegetation and was presenting it to the older one with the authority of a discoverer. The older one was skeptical. Garrett crouched beside them at 60 years old without ceremony and examined the frog with the same serious attention he brought to things that deserved it. Adelaide stood and watched him and thought, "My father would have liked you." She thought it clearly and completely the way she thought things now, without bracing against the edges of it. The grief had not left. It had simply found its place inside the life rather than in front of it, and it sat there where it belonged alongside everything else that was real and permanent and hers. The sun was fully up now, clearing the ridge and coming down into the valley with the warmth of September that you feel differently than summer warmth, more grateful for it, more aware of its temporary nature, more present to it while it is there. She had stepped off a stagecoach in Silver Creek, Wyoming territory in December of 1876 with a bag on her arm and a warrant coming toward her and nothing else she could count on. 28 years, 3 children, 4 grandchildren with a 5th on the way, if Clara's count was accurate. A house that had grown outward from its original bones until it held the life that had grown into it. A valley with a name on a federal courthouse record in Philadelphia beside the word vindicated. And this man, this yard, this morning, she walked across to where Garrett and the children were conducting their investigation of the frog, and Garrett looked up at the sound of her boots on the frozen grass, and his face did what her father's face had done on Sunday mornings in the Philadelphia kitchen, when she came downstairs and the accounts were done, and the lamp was warm, and there was nowhere either of them needed to be. It said, "Here you are, right where you are supposed to be." She had arrived finally and completely in the place she had not known she was traveling toward. The mountains held their position above the valley patient as they had always been, as they would always be. The grandchildren argued peacefully about the frog. The smoke from Edmund's cabin rose in a straight line in the still morning air. Garrett took her hand. They stood in the yard of the ranch they had built with their own hands in the valley that bore their name under the and generous sky of Wyoming. And the day continued around them with all the ordinary and extraordinary weight of a life that has been lived honestly and with intention and in the company of the right people. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.